What kind of legacy would you want to leave behind? Fact is, all of us won't know what our legacy will be or when we stop being able to write it. All we can do is take the time we're given on this planet in this life to carve it and hope that if we want to be remembered, it will be for the strength of our character and the stature of our accomplishments. September 5th, 2025. Team Bigfoot, in the midst of celebrating their 50th anniversary, would suffer a massive tragedy as not only an integral part of their operations, but also one of their best talents would suddenly pass away, that being Dan Runte. The man was one of the most integral and dominant drivers in monster truck history, someone who's basically associated with the sport itself, much like that of folks like Tom Meents and Dennis Anderson. An icon, a legend. However, I got asked from a buddy of mine, someone who didn't grow up in the same era as me, asked, who was Dan Runte? And for as much as I associate him with the most iconic truck of all time, there are folks out there who may not fully know why and how the legend was formed. So today, let's take some time to honor, remember, and celebrate the legacy of Mr. Dan Runte. We've got a lot to cover, so let's get started. Born May 30th, 1964 in Freeport, Illinois. While not much is known publicly about Dan's upbringing, one can venture it's like many folks who got into the sport. A penchant for vehicles and mechanic work, born from tinkering with farm equipment. Through this, Dan would get his first peek at what would basically become not only his employer, but his legacy. A blue Ford known as Bigfoot. Dan was immediately fascinated with his machine, and so, at 25 years young, Dan would join the operation as a crew member, helping wrench on these trucks. Bear in mind too, even by his hiring in 1989, Bigfoot was a huge undertaking, being one of only a handful of true multi-truck operations. Certainly the only one with multiple trucks running on any given weekend. Dan would fill this role for 2 years, crewing for folks like Rich Hoosier and Andy Brass. However, Bigfoot was becoming an international presence. The demand for the truck extended beyond the 50 states. Of course, most of its well-known drivers were already involved. Rich was busy with USHRA, and Andy was in the midst of the TNT points battle alongside fellow Bigfoot driver John Pyant. When Bigfoot made its first trip to Puerto Rico in 1990, they would send a young Runte to fulfill the duties. This would be his first true taste of pilot work. In a way, it's like how drivers like Brandon Arthur got their start in modern days. This would also segue into a tour with USA Motorsports in Australia in 1991, the first time US trucks traveled to the nation alongside Dennis Anderson and Pablo Huffaker. Dan would also visit Aruba and Curacao with Bigfoot. He was definitely becoming well-traveled through the team, representing the iconic blue Ford well beyond what the team could have ever expected. Don't get it twisted though. Domestic piloting was still in the cards for him, and Dan would get some of his first televised appearances in 1992, including what was his first televised win in Providence, Rhode Island, over the likes of Taurus, Equalizer, and Barefoot. This was the sign that Dan had truly arrived, but in 1993, the real legend would be made.
This is Trucks and Tractor Power, featuring the All-Stars of the Four-Wheel and Off-Road Jamboree Series.
I've said it before, but I would argue no point series in monster truck history is held with such reverence as the Penda Point Series. By 1993, both Andy Brass and Gary Porter would take turns at the crown. Bigfoot would expand to 3 entrants, Andy and the new Wildfoot, Gene Patterson and Bigfoot, which, shocker, I know, had driven Snakebite as Colt Cobra, but this left a vacancy in Snakebite. In come Ricky Rattler. Thing is, Dan has such an iconic voice that while maybe at the time people didn't know, in hindsight it's easy to tell it's him. This was his first real foray into a massive point series. And here's the thing, Andy would win the title, but this doesn't tell the story. Dan was good. Like, damn good. He started making finals, then he started winning, and winning. This wasn't just a talented driver. This was someone generational. He would win 4 events on the 1993 Penda season, which again, may not sound like much, but here is a rookie to the series, someone who never hit a track like this before, and to be this competitive is absolutely insane. The MTRA also thought so, as he would be rewarded Driver of the Year for that season and another 7 times for good measure. 1994, however, would be when serendipity hits, as in January of 1994, Dan would debut Bigfoot 14. This would be his longest tenure truck and the one he would be most known for, and arguably the most iconic Bigfoot truck of all time. Yes, even more than 4, more than 1. However, at this time, it was a brand new truck with a new name, and for the Penda series, a new identity, the Power Wheels Bigfoot. Dan would chalk up 4 wins on the season, but fall just behind Andy Brass in Bigfoot. Brass was still king, and it seemed like it was going to stay that way.
The Fall Nationals in Indianapolis usually means 2 things: foul weather and Bigfoot reigning over the competition, due in large part to this man, Andy Brass. But the most successful driver in monster truck racing history has announced he's stepping down when the season is over.
Well then. Bear in mind too, Gene Patterson had stepped away from the team for the time being. So now, Dan was in essence the top guy. The pressure was on heading into 1995. He had the biggest team on his shoulders, and now he wasn't in the shadow, but out in front. One would expect for most men they would falter under such pressure. Thing is, Dan Runte isn't most men. When the dust settled, Dan Runte was the 1995 Penda Points champion, his first title. Now, he wasn't the upstart kid. He was the established guard, and he was guarding the throne like his life depended on it. 1996, now running the flagship Bigfoot name, would be the same for Dan, with win after win after win after win. Really, aside from a very bad wreck in Springfield, this was as close as a perfect season as you could expect, and Dan would handily take the Penda title. 1997, of course, would mark the last Penda series, and would not even be aired on TV, as Eric Meager would get the crown in Snakebite. But don't think Dan fell off, as he finished a close second. Dan would also run with Monster Jam in what was the team's final years with USHRA, including some wins in their pre-World Finals in Charlotte and for USA Motorsports in 1997 and 1998, which would end up accruing most of his coverage on TV post-Penda. However, Dan was not content with championships. He also wanted records. See, in some events back in the 1990s, there would be long jump competitions, where Dan would set a record twice. But a lot of times, there would mainly just be a small car jump. No, if Dan wanted the record and keep it, he would need to do something unprecedented, something that would be hard to beat. September 11th, 1999. No jokes, please. Outside of Nashville, Tennessee, Dan would attempt something no one thought was possible: jumping a 747 jet. But not only that could he land it, Dan would hit the gas, keep it straight, and sailed over the jet, landing with a massive bounce. But not only did he shatter the record by 60 feet, the truck actually survived the jump. This is arguably one of the most iconic monster truck moments of all time. So many people, even who know nothing about the sport, have likely seen this exact clip play out. Dan would attempt to follow this on a TV special called I Dare You, during the era where live stunt broadcasts were really popular, jumping the Bigfoot trailer in Las Vegas, although here he would snap a wheel off and not beat his prior record. Still, he proved himself as much a stuntman as he was a racer. With 2000 turning, as we've seen many times of course, coverage of Bigfoot becomes a lot more scant with the rise of Monster Jam, and of another Illinois boy with a need for speed becoming the hottest new thing in the sport. But Dan was still out there putting in work. The early 2000s brought about the Pro MT series, a sort of successor to the Penda series, with Dan taking the 2001 crown and finishing close behind on 2000 and 2002. Dan also was starting to really master this newfangled freestyle thing, as the trucks would become really known for slap wheelies. Seriously, early 2000s Bigfoot trucks are probably the best wheelie machines in the history of the sport. Dan would also rack up wins on the Ed Beckley Checker Flag Promotions Tour through the early 2000s. One of those stops being in Woodstock, Georgia, where an 8-year-old kid would see monster trucks for the first time in person with Dan sweeping the event. Dan would also get some film credits, helping in the Charlie's Angels reboot that, while not held with particular reverence, he did help create an iconic scheme that would become a fan favorite. 2005 would bring about some developments. First, it would mark Bigfoot's 30th anniversary, and so to celebrate, some throwback schemes would be designed, and also, too, the Outdoor Channel would launch Monsters of Destruction, where Runte would take part in representing the Ford against the likes of drivers like Rick Swanson, Dan Patrick, Craig Christensen, and future teammate Amber Walker. While Dan would not clinch the tour either season, he still kept competitive, and really too, what's impressive is how multidisciplined he was as a driver. Like, this tour ran from the most shoebox of arenas to large speedways, and Dan still found a way to perform at a top level. However, by this time too, he was alternating between 14 and 15. Both trucks were over a decade old at this point. Like, okay, let's give a comparison. In 1994, when Bigfoot 14 debuted, to the end of this year, 2005, Dennis Anderson had debuted and driven Gravedigger 12, then back to Gravedigger 7, then Gravedigger 14, then Gravedigger 19, and finally Gravedigger 20. The team had been planning the newest truck, Bigfoot 16, for several years, but given that it had been so long, it did take a while. However, with the new Major League of Monster Trucks tour on the horizon, they would debut Bigfoot 16, and Dan would pilot the new machine. Dan's first new ride in over 10 years. How'd he fare? Pretty damn good. Bear in mind too, this tour was a who's who of talent at the time. Scott Hartsock, Mike Hawkins, David Smith, Jim Kohler, and of course a man we've spoken about already, and arguably Dan's biggest rival during this time, Mark Hall. But Dan still came out on top. What's wild too is these tracks included many winding turns. This wasn't in a lot of cases a straight line drag where reaction time was everything, but still, in a brand new truck, Dan showed why he was one of the best. Dan would continue to become acquainted with Bigfoot 16 and winning a multitude of events over the 2008 season, including a marquee win at Gateway near the team's home turf of St. Louis. I know it's going to sound like I'm glossing over these next few years, because really there weren't that many points battles besides CFP and family events, which the latter was dominated by the Halls. So instead, I want to point you all to some of my favorite showings of him courtesy of the Monster Blog. The aforementioned Gateway event, LaPorte 2009, Pocatello 2009, which brought back the Rickety Rattler motif, and both of the Indianapolis events in 2008 and 2009. Really, if you saw this blue and white summit scheme, you knew you were in for a show. Dan would also put the name Bigfoot to literal use, as he would set the land speed record in 2009. And while this was broken alongside the long jump record the following year, it still showed he very much was gunning to be the best of the best. But 2010 had more of a focus. See, the team was celebrating their 35th anniversary, and to coincide, Dan and the team would unveil a throwback to the original body, with the aforementioned Amber Walker running a Miss Bigfoot design for the four-wheel Jamboree season. Dan, however, would clinch up the four-wheel title in the following year, 2011, the first for Bigfoot, breaking the Hall brothers' domination. He definitely was going all in for it if his race against Rammunition in Indianapolis was any indicator. The routine was Dan would run Bigfoot 16 through the winter and the family events season in the summer, but routines need to be switched. In the closing of 2011, the team would unveil Bigfoot 18, a brand new truck featuring a first-of-its-kind trophy truck body, and also in 2012, a new tour called Toughest Monster Truck Tour would feature the Bigfoot team heavily, where Dan would go on an insane 5-title streak. The team would run through the four-wheel Jamboree again, where Dan would take the long jump record back some 13 years after his original attempt, pushing the new Bigfoot 18 to its absolute limit. Dan would also get some redemption in Aruba that year, after what may be the wildest monster truck entrance back in 2000. While the TMTT tour continued and new faces entered that would become prominent, Dan continued to hold them off through 2013, and we head into 2014. The team would unveil a special 25th anniversary scheme for Runte, as well as having him compete in his hometown of Freeport in a massive full circle moment. I think this right here signified the relationship between Dan and Bigfoot. Like, here's something interesting. Dan never drove a truck that wasn't Bigfoot or Bigfoot affiliated ever, not even for a fill-in. 2014 also marked my second time seeing Dan and the first time seeing Bigfoot in 10 years, as both him and Larry Swim would be on hand for the Summit Motorama at Atlanta Motor Speedway, with Summit, of course, being one of their main sponsors. 2015 would once again mark another anniversary for Bigfoot, this time being their 40th anniversary. And, to coincide, Dan would once again get a new ride, this time the brand new Bigfoot 21, this marking his final full-time ride. Dan would once again clinch up the toughest crown, and at the Summit Motorama that year, the team would, for the first time since, I think, Nashville 1990, have every Bigfoot presence in one place. This is a small aside, but this honestly is one of the most fortunate things I ever got to see in person. 22 years ago, Andy Brass announced his retirement in Indianapolis. Now, 22 years on, at the start of the 2016 toughest season, Dan Runte would announce this would be his final full season of competition. He would run some throwback designs selected by the fans that paid tribute to his most iconic schemes. Dan, much like his mentor Andy, would end his career on top, taking his final title at his final full-time event, making this his final of an insane 14 titles as a Bigfoot pilot, the most of any driver in the team's history. Larry Swim would succeed the throne and continue to run strong until his own retirement. But here's the thing with Dan. Just because he was done with full-time driving doesn't mean he was done with Bigfoot. Quite the opposite. See, Dan would in essence take a role that akin to Jim Cramer, focusing more on the operations side, as well as training the new drivers who would join the Bigfoot family. Dan would still pilot here and there, prominently driving in Kuwait, returning with 14, as well as back on Toughest in 2019 for fill-in work. Dan would also be featured in the Bigfoot Open House events, including in 2024, celebrating his 35th year with the team, and in 2025 debuting the brand new Bigfoot 24 alongside the team's 50th anniversary. Dan would also fill in for Australia in 2025, fittingly returning to a country that welcomed him with open arms in the infancy of his career. However, on the morning of September 5th, 2025, Dan Runte would be taken from us in a traffic accident while he was en route to work. From his early 20s up until what would be his final days, he kept dedicated to the Bigfoot operation. Outpouring of support would come immediate and substantial, with individuals from across the entire industry and fandom. Even Monster Jam, an organization that Dan had not participated with since 1998, paid tribute to the man. All corners of the fandom would give their sentiments and tributes to a man that was iconic to the sport. And in some small way, this video right here is my own way of paying tribute. Honestly, while this video was meant to be both an honoring and a career retrospective, I think what I really want this to be is a springboard. Go watch those old Penda points battles. Go watch those old USA Motorsports events, or the specials, or the plethora of coverage from the Monster Blog, and see why Dan is and will always be considered one of the best there ever was and will be. I've spent however long working on this, and I still don't feel any amount of time would be enough because that's just how much Dan meant to this industry as a whole. The accomplishments he accrued and how integral he was not only to Bigfoot but to the sport as a whole. How intertwined he is with monster trucks is something very few could ever even come close to. But honestly, this all is only half the tale. But I've spoken about Dan the driver. But in the wake of his passing, what people were talking about more rightfully so was Dan the man. Not even just his nickname, but Dan Runte as a person, as a father, as a husband. The simple fact is, for someone who was as decorated and revered as he was, he could have easily gotten a massive ego and let it all go to his head. Yet story after story poured in across his career from different people, all from different walks of life, and yet every tale was some version of the same sentiment. Dan was a humble man, Someone who never forgot where he came from, nor the fans that helped ensure he could take all these opportunities. I won't sit here and act like I knew him very personally. I was fortunate enough to meet him 3 times, but every time he still had the same smile, the same demeanor, the exact same one that millions of fans, drivers, and crew connected with. Grief exists because of love. The more we love, the more we grieve. It's the double-edged sword of this whole thing of life. The fact the loss of Dan stings so much and hurts so much is not just the suddenness of it all, but how much he meant to us. I, like many kids, would be glued to my TV, watching this man from Illinois take a gigantic piece of machinery and do things no one thought possible. A lucky few of those kids would grow up to compete alongside him. There will never be another Dan Runte, but that just makes the man he was all the more special, and the memories and spirit he left behind all the more present. I opened this video talking about legacy, and I firmly believe the legacy he created, that Dan will never be forgotten, because we the fans will let him be forgotten. And what more could you ask anyone for? Dan, we love you, we will miss you, but we will always cherish you and the legacy you left.
Well, Dan, I tell you what, congratulations to you and the crew. Everybody really had to work for this.
Thanks, Army. Yeah, they did. You know, the crew's been working real hard between the 2 trucks. We got to give them all the credit in the world.
Trucks and really all these trucks were doing back 20 years ago or 25 years ago when I